Hello and welcome everyone. Today we have Ilya presenting the long tail effect of personalized rankings. You have 50 minutes.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's great to be here. Great to see some familiar faces. So today I'm going to talk about my new paper. We titled it "The Long Tail Effect of Personalized Rankings," and it's co-authored with two brilliant people. One is Rob Donnelly, who I think is still sleeping, or maybe he's already here. I think, yeah, he might come here in a second. And the second one is Ayush Kanodia, who is a PhD student in computer science at Stanford University. And so I scheduled a few pauses for questions, but obviously feel free to jump in and interrupt if you want to ask something. All right, so what is this about? Well, we started this paper with a very obvious observation that as markets were shifting from offline to online, consumers got access to kind of an increasingly large and overwhelming variety of products. And it became very clear early on, and now we have evidence from that, evidence of that from the empirical consumer search literature, that people don't really search much. You know, they don't really click on many products, they don't view many products, they almost never go beyond whatever the first page or first few pages of search results. And it became clear that to succeed in online retail, you need kind of to provide some degree of personalization and personalizing consumer experience and helping consumers to do their search more efficiently. And so people started implementing these personalization systems, personalization algorithms. Computer scientists started writing a lot of papers about that. And so at this point, we have accumulated kind of a gigantic body of papers that design and improve the existing recommendation algorithms or personalization algorithms. And this field is very applied in the sense that a lot of online retail companies are actually using these algorithms in practice right now. And despite that widespread usage of personalization algorithms, we still know very little about how these algorithms, when they actually kind of implemented in practice, affect online markets. And so what we will be asking as a research question in this paper is, to what extent personalization shapes things like consumer choice in online markets, and we then will particularly focus on the issue of sales concentration. To what extent personalization leads to a much larger variety of products being consumed, and what does that mean in terms of to what extent that benefits consumers or retailers, or some combination of both. Now, why do we care? Now, very quickly, one reason to care is computer scientists are investing a lot of effort into designing and improving this algorithm. So that's a very big industry, and we want to know what happens to online markets when they do a good job. Second, to the extent that we think personalization allows people to discover and buy niche products or kind of unusual products with unusual designs, we may also expect that in the long term, all of this will create a kind of much larger incentives for sellers and manufacturers to introduce new niche products to start with. And so we want to document, we want to understand these long-term effects. Finally, if we believe that personalization makes the market less concentrated and people start buying a larger variety of products, then anything like privacy regulation that removes firms' ability to personalize may actually undo some of these effects. And we want to understand whether that's the case. All right. What do we know so far? Well, this is a very, very quick review of the literature. I don't mean to review kind of all literature on this topic. That would be impossible because of the size of the computer science literature on this. Let me talk about a little bit about kind of the emerging literature that try to evaluate the empirical effects of personalization. So all of this started, I think, with the seminal book of Chris Anderson on the long tail effect, where he basically conjectured that while it's true that in online markets we see this very, very long tail of niche and unusual products, thousands and millions of options offered, none of that would survive without some degree of personalization. And so the goal of personalized algorithms, or at least that's how Chris Anderson thought about it, was to find the people who are looking for something very unusual and match them to the products that fits them very well and fits their preferences very well. Now, that was his conjecture. Many people talked about it, but few actually tested it. And I want to kind of refer to two papers here that made an initial attempt to test it. One was Lee and Hosanagger's paper, where they ran a field experiment in online retail. And they basically found that the opposite is true to Chris Anderson conjecture. So in particular, they found that once the retailer started personalizing, people started buying a lot smaller variety of products, and the market concentration increased. And the market share of niche products actually went down after personalization was introduced. Now, the second paper here, which is very relevant, is Holtz et al. I think it's still a working paper. So they looked at Spotify recommendations of, I believe it was podcasts in their case. And they found that they found something that's more consistent with Chris Anderson's conjecture, which is once Spotify starts personalizing its recommendations, people start listening to a much larger variety of podcasts, niche podcasts, unusual podcasts. And so that kind of generates long tail effect in consumption. Now, the fact that the evidence is mixed in these papers is puzzling, and that warrants further research on its own. But I think most importantly for us, one thing that was missing from the literature so far is the fact that this literature has not asked whether any of this is good or bad for consumers or retailers or both. And so the question we specifically want to answer here is, if we see that personalization generates this long tail, which is something that we will document in detail in our paper, is that actually good for consumers? Is it all about the retailer just convincing people to buy products that otherwise would not be popular? Maybe they're not really a good match for consumers, but now people buy them because of personalization. Or is it really because of something Chris Anderson had in mind, which is we are finding people who are looking for something unusual, and we are trying to match them to a perfect item. All right.
Yeah, can I ask a question about this literature? I mean, intuitively, it seems that what is important is how diverse the preferences of individuals are in the first place. Say, if everybody if the preferences are somewhat homogeneous, then it's probably not so surprising that algorithms lead to more concentration, because they all get recommended actually the same thing. So does this literature also have a measure for how heterogeneous or homogeneous the preferences of individuals are?
It definitely, so people definitely in this literature make a point that you need some heterogeneity for these effects to arise, because obviously all the above applies only to the extent that people want different things. If they want the same things and you are successful at personalization, you're gonna send them to the same list of bestsellers, and that produces the opposite effect. I think I don't want to go into that much detail here, but in our case, we're going to do several things. We're going to actually document the amount of heterogeneity we see in our data when we're going to argue that. We're going to look at a kind of a good example of a market where there's potentially a lot of preference heterogeneity. Like we're going to be talking about furniture, and there are furnitures of different styles, colors, materials, and we think people are looking for different things. And we are basically asking kind of a question, assuming there's some assuming we expect some heterogeneity in preferences, what do personalization algorithms do exactly? That's not obvious, because part of the literature, and for example, on the computer science side, said, look, we know these algorithms are designed to match people to niche products. That's the goal. But a lot of kind of modern state-of-the-art algorithms are actually not very good at recommending niche products, just because there's not that much data for those products. Nobody buys them. And so, to some extent, it's not even obvious that we should see this effect, even when there is a lot of heterogeneity. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
All right. So
can I ask a question about like, especially if you're looking at furniture, it seems that another way to cater to preferences is to offer something that's customizable. So certainly at some point people were very excited about kind of computers where you could plug in whatever chip you wanted and color and blah blah blah. Furniture, it really seems like a thing where once they get you to a particular furniture maker, maybe they can put different cloths on the sofa or different colors or blah blah blah. So I wonder how this I mean, this kind of comes back to the product design question as well. Are we better off having lots of different goods, or like one flexible thing that people can change up a lot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good point. I think, you know, it's entirely plausible that in the limit, a lot of these companies will have so many products that it will not make sense to have kind of personalized recommendations and rankings anymore. They would just tell you, okay, give us all the details about your ideal sofa or ideal bed, and we're going to design something that looks just like that. Maybe they will have a capability to do this. Now they don't. And so we're going to look at the company that basically has a lot of products to offer. It's not a platform, but it's a company that buys furniture from different manufacturers. It kind of coordinates all of these supply chains, and it offers, you know, 10,000 different sofas. And the question they're asking is, how do we match people to sofas, basically? So there's no customization happening in our context. But again, maybe we will see more of that in years to come. All right, so very quickly, what do we do in this paper?
The flip side is maybe we see less of it than we used to. I mean, maybe there was a ton of customization going on that doesn't have to happen anymore.
That could be. Yeah, I'd be curious to see.
Just for the welfare interpretation, that's potentially relevant.
Yeah, no, that's super relevant. Yeah, no, I'll be curious to see someone kind of documenting these trends, but I'm not sure to what extent we see less personalization now. And so what we do in this paper specifically is basically two things. We're going to show you the results of a field experiment where a random subset of consumers actually saw a personalized product rankings. And by product rankings, I mean it's literally just the order in which products are arranged on the category page. And we're going to show you kind of what that does to consumer choices and then to the variety of products people click on and search and buy. And then in the second part of the paper, we'll actually kind of, to get to the welfare question, we will write down and estimate an empirical choice model. I will preview this very quickly, but I will go into detail a bit later. So we will be thinking about kind of three aspects of it. One is it's going to be a simple, basically consideration set model. And we're going to augment it by introducing this idea of latent factorization from machine learning. And the idea there is very simple. We're going to kind of basically argue that there are a lot of products. Some of them are niche products. We cannot possibly describe them with observed attributes, of which we have very few in the data. And so we're going to assume there are latent attributes that consumers see and we as researchers don't see. And we're going to estimate those latent attributes directly from the data. And I will show you in detail how we do it later. The second thing is we want to estimate heterogeneity of preferences. That's difficult to do, especially for the situation like ours, where we have a durable product. There's no panel in purchases. We could use search data to estimate something like preference heterogeneity, but search data are very sparse in many applications, including ours. You see a lot of people just clicking on one or two items, and that gives you some information, but maybe not enough. And so what we're going to do is our innovation will be to actually use some combination of search data, and we're going to also use the data on personalized rankings with the idea that what you see in your rankings when you go to the online retail website, it kind of contains information about what the retailer has already learned about your tastes from your browsing histories. And now retailer may has other things in mind and other objectives, and we're going to account for that as well. And after accounting for that, we're going to extract information about preferences from rankings directly. Finally, we're going to think about position effects. Very simple idea. Sometimes you just click on something because it's at the top of the page, it has nothing to do with the product. We want to separate that from true preferences because that's critical for welfare. And just to preview the results very quickly, we show three things. One is we show that personalized rankings kind of dramatically increase the diversity of different items being purchased. It makes people more active. People click more often, buy more things, and buy a larger diversity of things, or larger diversity of furniture items. Second, we document that this is good for both consumers and the retailer. It's good for the retailer because they sell basically more items. It's good for consumers because specifically, we document that most of the increase in consumer surplus, and I think we see something like a 30% increase in the consumer surplus of the average consumer, most of that is coming from the fact that people with unusual preferences, or we call them people with niche preferences, are now better matched with niche items. And we will have a very clear definition of what niche item and niche preference means within the model. Okay, and finally, kind of having estimated the model and showed you these basic results, we're going to have some sort of a back of the envelope calculation where we argue that the fact that the retailer can personalize in the first place allows this retailer to offer more items. In particular, our calculations suggest that if this retailer did not have a chance to personalize or did not have a technology to personalize, it would have offered 4 times more items than they are currently offered on the website. Let me stop here and see if there are any questions.
I have a small question about the magnitude of the effects that you find. So if if the consumer surplus was like 1 cent before, maybe the 30% increase isn't so large. So do you have also dollar values to these 5 and 30% or something like that?
Yes, we're going to show you some dollar values, and we're going to calculate that the total increase in consumer surplus is in the order of 15 million, I believe.
But per consumer, maybe it would be even more helpful. Or
right. So I yeah. Let me show you the exact numbers once we get to the results.
Thanks.
Those numbers are substantial. Are there any questions on the general setting, research questions? Okay. Then let me move on. Data. So here's what we got. So we collaborated with Wayfair.com. It's a large online retailer of furniture and home improvement goods based in US. We got a data set from them that covers the period of 2 months, from September to November 2019. And we narrowed down the sample to the category of beds. So the beds is a category that's very large. It absorbs kind of a large share of revenues of Wayfair, so it's strategically important. And most importantly, it actually offers a lot of products. And so I think the total number of products being offered in this category is something like 10,000. And so that makes our discussion about long tail very meaningful in this context. Sometimes people come to this category to shop multiple times. So we see all of these visits. And for each of these visits, we see what consumers see during the visit. So we see the product rankings that they are shown, the order in which products are displayed. We see prices of products. We see basic characteristics of products, such as, apart from price, the material, color, some information about the style of furniture, and all kind of these basic things. And in addition, we know what people do on the platform. We know what they click on in response to these product rankings. We know how many pages of search results they open, and we know what they buy in the end, if they buy anything. So for those of you who haven't seen Wayfair's website, it looks very standard. It's basically, if you type beds on the website, it sends you to this category with the list of products. So the ordering of this list that you see on the screenshot right now is the ordering we're going to basically personalize in the experiment. And then once you click on one of these beds, if you're interested, that sends you to the product page. All of this is very standard. You see customer reviews, textual descriptions, additional product characteristics, and all of those things. So what was the experiment? So Wayfair ran an experiment where they basically randomized people into 2 groups. 95% of consumers saw some version of personalized rankings. And so it's important to understand that those personalized rankings were generated by a certain algorithm. That algorithm is a fairly standard. It's some version of a collaborative filtering algorithm that basically most, if not all, online retail companies are using when they personalize. And so that's kind of the outcome of that algorithm produces personalized product sorts or product orderings for each consumer that consumers see in this treatment group. In the control group, which is a 5% of all users, we call it the holdout group. People just see bestseller-based rankings. So basically, all products are ordered by historical popularity, bestsellers at the top. And what I want to emphasize here is, while we are going to look at one specific implementation of this algorithm of one specific company, we are here thinking about this comparison of what happens under personalization that's generated by this collaborative filtering algorithm, which is very standard, compared to the world without personalization, where the company is using bestseller-based rankings. And to some extent, we think that this is a trade-off many companies are thinking about when they start personalizing. Do I go from the simple popularity-based sort to something more advanced like collaborative filtering, or do I stay with the initial sort I had?
Excuse me,
So,
could I just intervene with the question?
Of course.
When you talk about personalization at the product level, would you mind just giving examples? Are you talking about personalization by price category, by aesthetic category, whatnot? Just what are the menu variations that are offered?
So the personalization is not at the product level, is at the user level. So if you're a new user, you come to the platform, they send you to either to treatment or to control group. If you end up in treatment group, from now on, you will see personalized rankings. And what personalization means is basically once you are in this category, or you're looking at this list of all beds that they are selling on the website, I'm going to show you your personalized list. So in the past, you looked at, I don't know, kind of modern looking sofas and modern looking tables. I understand that, okay, so you like modern looking furniture. I'm going to show you a personalized list in which modern looking beds are placed at the top. So that's the kind of personalization we're thinking about.
So it's in aesthetic categories, essentially, right?
The algorithm is trying to learn your preferences over different attributes, basically.
Okay.
So it might be aesthetic appeal, it might be style, it might be more basic things like material, color, whatever. But
it could also be price sensitivity, right?
Sorry, say again?
It could also be price sensitivity, though.
It could also be price sensitivity.
Okay, this is all contained in one algorithm. Okay.
And yes. So what does the website know about you? Only your past searches on the website, or does it know also age, family composition? I don't know what kind of things.
Yes, so they know some basic demographics, like I think they know age and some estimate of income, although they don't know income of specific consumers. They know where people live, more or less. So that's kind of the fixed part. And then the variable part is they know your browsing histories from other categories as well. So if this is the first time you're looking for a bed, but you already shopped for sofas, tables, and so on, I will know that.
But they only know the browsing history on this website, not on other websites.
Only on this website. That's correct.
Okay.
So Ilya, I have two questions sort of related to the consumer. One is some of their search is happening on Wayfair and some of it is happening off of Wayfair. So, and potentially they might be learning things on Wayfair that are useful for them elsewhere. So I don't know whether that means we're underestimating or overestimating the effects. And the sort of second thing here is we're getting all this personalization based, conditional on the search term, but the search term could itself be endogenous. So if I'm not finding stuff that I like very much, then rather than looking for beds, I'm going to put in cheap king-sized modern beds or something, and that's going to give me a whole host of other. That will change the ranking even more dramatically, I suspect.
Right. So
how do I think about that?
Yeah. Okay. So let me take it one at a time. So to the first question, it's true you might do search more broadly across platforms. Something you learn here might be useful elsewhere, and vice versa. I think that's fine for our model. We can have a more detailed discussion once you see the model, but to the extent that you kind of learned your preferences browsing elsewhere and people come to Wayfair with different preferences, we're going to capture it as preference heterogeneity. And that to the extent that you want to browse on Wayfair and leave without buying, that's going to be your outside option. And so to some extent,
But you're going to take a fixed outside option.
Right. Yes, exactly. And so, yeah, we can discuss if you're thinking about some specific bias once I show you the model. And then the second question was about, do people just type, I want a king size bets or something like that in the search to narrow down their search results? Interestingly, on this platform, they don't do it much. And so only less than 5% of people did anything to narrow down their search. And that's true. And by narrow down, I mean using filters, search queries, and so on. And that's true even in the sample where the rankings were not personalized. And so it was a bit puzzling to us. I don't know if there's something about search tools on this website that does not work well, or people are just happy with these sorts, but we are not going to worry about it that much empirically, at least in this specific setting.
Could I just, when you say narrowing down search results or your search process, is that all before purchase, or is it also before exiting?
Yeah, so let me take that question a bit later when I show you the model. I think it will become more clear once you see the structure.
Okay.
All right. So for now, let's keep going with this part. So very quickly, so that remember some people will see personalized rankings, some non-personalized. Those two groups are randomly assigned. We were worried about a few things here. The assignment was not 100% perfect because sometimes people clean their cookies and come back to the website, and you kind of lose them and you don't know whether that's the same person. Our estimate that did not really affect that many users, and we were worried a lot about it, but our conservative estimate says that it affected about 4% of users whom we could not really track over time. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. And we try to kind of re-estimating everything with and without users that we think got in the wrong group, and things didn't change much. Second, when you come back to the website repeatedly, your rankings change a little bit, and we wanted to have a kind of a clean definition of your treatment of the rankings you saw. So we are taking just the earliest visit of each customer within this website, within this data set. And third, we are still somewhat missing detailed demographics data. We have some basic demographics in order to check kind of randomization balances. But basically, we checked that the algorithm or the randomization algorithm was indeed assigning 95% of people to treatment correctly on each date during our sample and on each hour of the day. And we also show that kind of the basic shopping habits of people in these two groups are comparable as well, in terms of, for example, the time of the day where they prefer to shop. All right, so some results. I'm not going to go through all of that, but let me show you some key ones. One thing we see is there's a lot more activity in terms of people clicking on items. So we see that when we switch from non-personalized to non-personalized rankings, we double the number of people who click anywhere, who click on at least one item. And that the size of that effect is kind of very surprising, because that effect is large and we could not fully reproduce it within our empirical model. We could reproduce some part of it, but not as much. But then kind of a slightly more reasonable estimate is the second effect, which is conditional on clicking somewhere. You click on 20% more items. So that we can reproduce, and that's also a highly statistically significant effect we see. And finally, the purchase rate increases from 2.3% under non-personalized rankings to 2.5%. So that's the increase in purchase rate by 8%. So overall, we see a lot more activity, and people search more, people click on more items within this category, and people are also more likely to buy. Now, here we see some preliminary evidence that this is good for both consumers and the retailer. It's good for consumers because they just buy more items or more often, which suggests that they are finding something they really like. Moreover, we don't see any evidence that people are now directed towards more expensive items, which are maybe having higher markups. So if anything, at the bottom of the table here, you see that they are buying cheaper items now in the personalized group, although that effect is a bit more noisy than others. And we also find that the retailers' revenues per user increased by 4.5%. And here we don't report the exact revenues because of the confidentiality of the data, but this effect is also statistically significant. And so overall, we take this as kind of a first evidence that personalization is actually matching people to products much better, and that generates benefits on both sides, for consumers and for the retailer.
But of course, that depends quite a bit on the type of algorithm that you have. And so can you say something general about personalization strategies, or do you just measure that this particular algorithm apparently does reasonably well?
That's great. That's a very reasonable question. And I think, we spend a lot of time thinking about the external validity of this because, this is, you're right, one algorithm and one implementation. But, to some extent, what Wayfair is doing here is basically they're using a typical state-of-the-art collaborative filtering algorithm, which is maybe not 100% exactly what other companies are using, but basically it is the same algorithm as other online retailers are using for personalization. Now, sure, different platforms may kind of different how much revenue optimization they add to this algorithm on top of the kind of the standard structure. But the core is the same, and to the extent that this algorithm is used very broadly, we think we are documenting something that might apply more broadly in other online retail companies as well. Right. Other questions? Yeah.
Yes, I have some, but you probably mentioned this. I wasn't just attentive enough. So again, if I log on multiple times and I get some personalization list, you look at the first one that I saw.
Just the first one.
But then you still look at what I bought at the end, right? So I could have visited the site 7 times, gotten different things, and then bought something much later, right?
Yeah, exactly. So sorry, I was not clear about that. We are looking at the first rankings that you saw, but we are looking at all your activity after that. So think about that as measuring long-term effect of those rankings.
Okay, and can I ask one more thing? Can the prices that I see across my different visits change? First of all, either, for example, there are company level sales, or could they be changed for me personally as well? So 2 questions there.
Yes, no personalization in prices whatsoever. So that just doesn't exist. Prices change somewhat over time. We don't see any strong evidence that people are shopping for or people are waiting for lower prices. So we to that, and I can talk a bit more about it offline.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
Right. May I also ask a question, please?
Of course.
Yeah, so I just regarding this table, so I kind of tried to come up with a theoretical justification of that. And it seems for me that you kind of think that with personalized ads, you have, on average, you should have a better match with the product. But at the same time, it seems that consumers simultaneously kind of learn that the overall pool of available matches is much better, and that even overshoots this effect for earlier stopping. Because on the one hand, I'm very encouraged with what I see on my first item, and I think, well, it's very good, I'm probably more likely to stop. But given that they click more and actually click more, by more than the difference in the buying probability, it seems that the learning effect is much stronger. So I also think that the rest of what I can see is much better, which is somewhat surprising because of this overshooting.
Right. So I mean, yeah, we can have a more detailed discussion of that in the model part, because we are going to have a pretty reduced form way to capture that effect. We're not thinking about kind of a fully structural model of everything that's happening here, and you'll see how we think about that. It on some basic level, it makes sense because you just kind of are more likely to show people items that they get excited about. They click on them more. Assuming the search costs are not very high, you will see a lot of clicks. Now, I'm less sure about kind of this dynamic optimal stopping rule, and we can discuss that in a bit.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let me show you. So probably my favorite graph from the paper. So this graph basically shows the distribution of market shares across products with and without personalization. Now, on the horizontal axis here, we order products by their popularity in the world without personalization. So on the left, there are products that are more popular. On the right, products that are less popular. The dashed line shows the distribution of market shares across products under personalization, the solid line without personalization. And what we see here is basically this: as we kind of move from non-personalized to personalized world, the curve rotates counterclockwise, meaning that the items that were very popular without personalization all of a sudden lose market shares. And the items that were not as popular gain market shares, and you see kind of this the long tail of purchases emerging on the website. And here we somewhat truncated the number of items we're looking at, but there are a lot more items in the real data set. And this is kind of very consistent with the Chris Anderson's work I was citing earlier. So what he thought about is exactly this picture. He thought about the fact that personalization actually allows people to find all these kind of niche products that are usually hidden from people and that are usually hard to discover. And we find evidence consistent with the fact that once Wayfair starts personalizing, all of these products become more visible and all of them start gaining market shares. Now, maybe that's a bit more abstract as evidence. So just to give you a few examples, if you look at the products that lose popularity under personalization, you see this kind of products. So this is kind of a random sample of products from the group that loses market shares. You see beds with kind of very boring designs, neutral colors, neutral styles. There's nothing extraordinary here. But when you look at the products that actually gain market shares most under personalization, then you see something like this. Now you see these beds that are fancy looking beds with unusual shapes and bizarre colors and inbuilt LED lights and all kinds of things that I didn't even know exist before writing this paper. And so what basically we can kind of, the story we have in mind here is when you look at this graph and you look at all the products that suddenly gain market shares, this is what I want you to keep in mind. So these are the kind of products that are now discovered. These are the kind of products that are now purchased much more frequently. And this kind of represents very well the question we're asking. Like, we know people who want these beds exist. There is a heterogeneity of preferences, but we want to ask the question of how many of these people are there, and is the algorithm good enough at kind of matching people with these products that fit their preferences very well and fit their unusual preferences very well. All right, so let me stop and see if there are any questions, but otherwise I'll move on to the model. Okay, so in the model, we basically want to answer the welfare question. We are wondering, the previous graph I showed you, is any of this good for consumers? Are consumers really benefiting from this? We're going to be thinking about three main challenges here that we will try to address. One challenge is the fact that we have limited data to recover tastes. And so I already mentioned a little bit about that. We don't have panel in purchases. Search data are pretty sparse. And so we're going to look at personalized rankings and we're going to extract information from those. Second, we're going to think about kind of this large set of items that people choose from. And we know that some of these items are niche items that are unusual and they may appeal to consumers in ways that we cannot necessarily measure. If you prefer to buy a sofa that's that looks stylish or looks modern, we don't necessarily have an attribute in our data set that says the sofa is stylish, the sofa is modern. But we want to be able to capture that kind of variation in preferences. And so what we are doing is we are introducing so-called latent attributes. So that's based on this idea of latent factorization from computer science. Latent attributes is something that consumers see, but we researchers do not see. Now think about that as the furniture is stylish is one attribute of that kind. And we're going to estimate those directly from the data, together with all the taste parameters that describe how much people value observed and unobserved attributes and so on. Finally, we want to be able to estimate position effects. This idea that you might be clicking on items because they're at the top has nothing to do with the item, or you might be clicking there because you really like the item. We want to know which is which, and that's kind of the bias that Raluca Urso was also thinking about in her paper. The way we're going to solve it here is we're going to estimate position effects from the holdout sample. We're going to isolate the within product variation in a product position. So there's no personalization there. So whenever a position of a product deviates from its average long-term position, that variation, we argue, is as good as random in this sample. And we're going to estimate position effects and then go to the personalized sample and assume that conditional on position effects, we can recover preferences there. That's a general structure. And I'm going to show you in a second all the equations, but let me know if there are any questions before we move on there. Okay. All right, so very simple model. So our goal here, as a general statement, is our goal here was to come up with the simplest possible model that allows us to capture taste heterogeneity, that allows us to have latent attributes and estimate position effects, and yet the model that would be scalable enough to be able to estimate it on our sample. And our sample has over 1 million consumers. And so here's the model we came up with. So I will start with the consumer choice model. At this point, you should imagine a person, let me go back for a second. You should imagine a person looking at this list of products. And so imagine for simplicity that you're looking at the first page. There are 50 products there. And so your set of products you're choosing from, JI, is going to be fixed to those 50 items you see, not all items that are offered on the website. You're going to compute so-called click utility for each product, where click utility of user I of item J is going to be this xj times beta I part. That's going to be just a standard random coefficient formulation. Beta I is your preference, xj are basic product attributes, minus alpha I times current price. Alpha I is a price sensitivity, plus, and this is the novel part, xi j times theta I, and that's the latent factorization part. So think about xi j's. Those are basically x's, but x's that we researchers do not see. And theta I is the preferences people have. So if the furniture is stylish, one of these xi j's can be a stylish furniture indicator. And theta I is a preference indicating that some people care about that and others could not care less. Minus gamma times Rij. Rij is really a position of product J in the rankings of user I. Gamma is the position effect. Here is linear, but in the model, we actually introduce a highly nonlinear curve to estimate position effects. Here, I'm just trying to keep it simple. And then plus this random normal shock eta ij. Now, we assume a very simple search rule, and that's to Alexei's question. So we're going very reduced form here and basically assume that you click on an item if and only if it has a positive click utility. And once again, while we are losing some of that power of the structural approach of modeling the dynamic stopping rule, what we are gaining here is our ability to scale the model and estimate it using 1 million of consumers. And that's really helpful for estimating very rich distribution of consumer preferences. Ultimately, that distribution is key for us to measure welfare. That model also allows us to have these latent attributes, which is also key for describing preference heterogeneity in this specific market, where observed attributes do not really explain that much. So that's the part where you decide what to click on. Now, once you click on items, you compute this UIJ purchase, your purchase utility, and it's basically identical to the expression before. Is the same expression, except for two parts. One is there are no position effects here, which means implicitly here we assume that the position effects only make the products more salient and they affect your choice through that channel, but they don't affect your perceived purchase utility directly. And the second is we introduce this xij term, which is going to be capture all the new information that you acquired while looking at the product page, after clicking on the product page, that you did not anticipate before. Okay, so that's basically a consumer choice model. It's very simple. Let me see if there are any questions. Okay, if there are no questions, let me show you what the retailer does in this model. the retailer does the following. So he does different things in two different groups, which I remind you are randomly assigned. So in the personalized group, he orders all the products by user-specific rank utilities, or we call them rank utilities, but they're really just product indexes. And they look as follows. The rank utility will look exactly as a click utility, for example, or a purchase utility. So this first part looks very familiar, except for these tilde terms. The idea here is that, while retailer might be thinking about your preferences when deciding on product orderings, the preferences the retailer is thinking about might not be the same as your true preferences. That might be because he doesn't know your preferences exactly and he has only a noisy signal. That might be because also he's just thinking to sell some other stuff that's high markup and that has nothing to do with your preferences. And so to some extent, we're going to kind of allow for the fact that his perceived user preferences, this beta I tilde, alpha I tilde, theta I tilde, are not necessarily the same as true preferences, but those things might be correlated. And we're going to estimate that correlation explicitly within the model. So that's the first part of this. The second part of this model is the holdout sample, and there things are much simpler. Nothing is personalized. So the retailer is still ordering products by so-called rank utilities, but now he computes these rank utilities as product fixed effects delta J plus, also that's just capturing popularity of different products, historical popularity, plus Wij times tau, where Wij is basically a dummy that the product is currently new or sponsored. Those products just get bumped to the top sometimes. Plus the same random normal shock mu Ij. And so you kind of think about two things we are trying to achieve here. One thing is we are trying to learn to what extent the retailer is thinking about consumers when trying to come up with personalized rankings, because that will tell us how much information about preferences we can extract from the rankings we see. And the second thing we're trying to do here is we are trying to estimate position effects from this sample, from the holdout rankings, with the idea that once we control for historical popularity and for new and sponsored items, the residual variation kind of within product position is going to be as good as random. And we're going to use that variation to understand what happens if you take a specific product and just shift it to a different position.
Hey, just so that you're aware, about 5 more minutes.
Perfect.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no worries. So this is perfect because almost done with the model. I'll skip this slide, but basically we have some way of parameterizing the true preferences and kind of the retailer's perceived preferences and introducing correlation between the two. And all I'm showing here is we kind of parameterize that, and we have a bunch of parameters that are responsible for that correlation, and we're going to estimate them from the data. So let me skip this. I'll briefly mention that the way we estimate the model is, this estimation was difficult because of the scale of the problem. We have, overall 60 product characteristics, preference heterogeneity along all of those dimensions. We have 1 million users in the data sample and 750 items, and often we have 30,000 plus parameters to estimate. That's a large problem to handle, and the way we handled it is basically we modified the existing MCMC sampler for a full information Bayesian probit model. And so once we have done that, that allowed us to introduce latent attributes that allowed us to scale estimation to the number of consumers we have. So, and there are a lot more details in the paper, but let me skip that in the interest of time. So what do we find? We find several things. The salient finding we kind of document once we have the model is this dramatic effect on concentration. So we see that the concentration is measured by the Herfindahl-Hirschman index based on clicks, or the share of clicks and the share of purchases different products absorb. That share drops by a factor of between 2 and 3 under personalization. And what's interesting is if you look at kind of a lot of items that were not popular without personalization, say items outside of top 100, those items were only getting something like 2-3% total market share. Now they have 30% market share. So you remember the graph that I showed you. Now, more interestingly, the effects on welfare, we do find, once we estimated kind of the correlation between the true tastes and retailers' incentives, we do find that the incentives are very much aligned, which means that when the retailer is kind of designing personalized rankings, he is very much thinking about consumer preferences, although that correlation is not exact, so which means he's also sometimes sending consumer to kind of wrong directions to buy items that he wants to promote. And so overall, think about this as kind of on the range between not caring about consumers at all and being fully benevolent and fully optimizing consumer surplus. Basically, the retailer is halfway, according to our estimates. And the correlation there is 0.5. We find that the average consumer increases their surplus by 30%. And here it's very important to realize that most of that in our results is driven by the fact that people with niche preferences are now better matched with niche products. So here we define niche products as some products that, so basically we're looking at each consumer's top 10% products based on the utility. And then we're asking, well, can we identify products that enter the top 10% utility for less than 10% of users? And the idea here is being that these products are really liked by some people, but not many people like them. Okay, that's our definition of niche products. You can see a lot more details in the paper. We then define a person as a person with niche preferences if more than half of the products in his top 10% are niche products. Okay, and then we account basically how many people with niche preferences are matched with niche products with and without personalization. And what we find is that kind of while the overall effect on welfare is it's increasing by 30%, which corresponds to the kind of a $5 million change in the total welfare in this category. More than half of this effect is actually driven by the fact that we have now a lot more niche matches. So, I showed you this example before. More than half of the effect that we document on consumer welfare is driven by the fact that we are now much better at matching people who want unusual and furniture to this kind of items you see on the screen. Okay, and then I'm almost done. Let me just preview one more result that's more like a back of the envelope calculation we did after estimation. What we were curious to ask here is basically to what extent personalization is allowing Wayfair to offer many products in the first place. So what we did here is some sort of a back of the envelope calculation that says, let's calibrate how costly it is to Wayfair to be offering each item on its website. So there's going to be some fixed cost of offering an item. We calibrate that in a certain way, assuming that right now Wayfair is more or less optimizing its assortment. We are then removing Wayfair's ability to personalize. So now all the consumers on the website must see non-personalized rankings. And then we are recomputing how many items and which of these items would be profitable to Wayfair to offer under this new scenario. And what we find is that the Wayfair in that scenario would only offer 25% of the current assortment, or in other words, personalization allows Wayfair, personalization of rankings allows Wayfair to offer 4 times more items according to this exercise. And I'll refer to the paper for more details on this. Almost done. So very quick summary, we do find that personalization in this case makes people a lot more active. It induces more search. We see more clicks, more purchases, and a much larger variety of products being purchased. We document that this is good for both consumers and the retailer. And in particular, that's good for consumers because now consumers with niche preferences are much better matched or can more quickly discover products that fit their unique preferences well. And we also show you some preliminary evidence that personalization and what allows the retailer to offer a lot of these niche items in the assortment in the first place. I will stop here. Let me see if there are any questions.
Thank you for a great presentation. Feel free to ask questions as they come to you.
I will leave slides here for now in case we want to kind of come back and discuss something.
I'll ask one then. So I think you may have said this, but I was trying to remember, which is you were looking at kind of the change in the tail versus kind of the popular items. How much reversal is there? So are there any items that were in the tail and aren't in the tail anymore? And do you kind of see churn in that?
Right. So that's interesting. We have not looked at that specific one. I mean, to some extent, we only looked at the distribution of sales. Tell me more. What do you have in mind? So what kind of items would be kind of go from a long tail to more popular ones? I guess kind of the products that were on the margin, they had a potential to be popular, but they would never be discovered. Those products become more popular. So think about this graph and think about, you know, maybe these products almost, right? It's not quite the long tail, but those products were, you know, just short of being discovered before, and now all of a sudden people see them. So I don't know if those are the kind of products you have in mind.
I'm more thinking about something that just is hard to find in a category simply because, you know, it's in such a large bin that if it was a normal sorting, most people wouldn't find it, but that it's not that it's a bad product, it's just not one that's general, right? Like, I don't quite have a specific thing in mind, but it might even be though going from 200 to 400 or 400 to 200, not necessarily all the way like up to the top in some sense.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting thought. We definitely thought a lot about, you know, to what extent you would actually be able to discover some of these products with the basic filtering and search tools. That back to Hesky's question. It's puzzling that people don't use these tools, but then if you think about it, you know, a lot of people are basically probably shopping and thinking, well, I want a sofa that looks stylish and that has an acceptable price. And they have some price in mind that they're looking for. Now, the website does not have a filter that says acceptable price. You can sort by price or you can sort by style, but it might be a bit difficult to kind of navigate to a set narrow enough that fits your preferences exactly. Now, the algorithm can do that. So the algorithm can actually learn that you are price sensitive, but not too much. And then you like this style of furniture. And so that the furniture that they're offering you then in the personalized list would be just the right match. So to some extent, these algorithms can achieve something that probably you would have a hard time achieving with the basic search tools.
So I'm a little curious on the you know, these very weird looking things were viable in the past. So were they? I mean, how should I think about that? Is this they're being offered elsewhere? It's like, you know, there's another site called weirdbeds.com or something, and if they're offering that, they might as well be on Wayfair also. You know, and related to that you alluded to on the kind of greater assortment, of course, the personalization part of the welfare benefit is going to come as we introduce it system-wide from the introduction of new products. You know, kind of like in Dan Ershoff's paper on apps, if you know that paper. So I'm just curious how these guys were viable in the past. Like, why do they exist? Why are they on Wayfair without personalization?
So one thing I need to be clear about is what we are looking at is a data sample that comes from the period where there was personalization. But because it's an experiment and people see these things at the same time, some personalized and some non-personalized, you, as Wayfair, you can actually offer all these products because 95% of people do see these items in the list. Funnily enough, a lot of the beds that I showed you were not available, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. They were introduced recently. Now, we don't have, I don't think we have data kind of good enough to make a causal statement of, you know, this was because of personalization. But the example I showed you in the very end, kind of our back of the envelope calculations are trying to get to that question just a little bit. And, you know, we hope that someone will go and write a better paper on that exact topic of what does this all do in the long term. You know, do retailers start to offer all these unusual, weird looking beds? Is that an effect that's caused by personalization or caused by some combination of factors here? But I think it's super interesting.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Yes. So do you have any thoughts about how might those personalized recommendation or rankings affect those sellers' pricing incentive? Of course, I know in your case, you only deal with like 4% of users. So sellers may not have incentive to adjust their prices, right? But in a larger scale case, when a website switch from, to personalized pricing, sellers may adjust their prices as well, right? I know that, oh, now those consumers who buy my product must be like my product much better. So I may have incentive to raise my price also. No, do you have any thoughts, or do you know any like empirical research in that dimension?
So in Dan's paper on apps, it was quality was the dimension rather than prices.
A quality one. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So what did he find? He found that the quality decreases.
He found that the quality, yeah, for the marginal ones coming in are crappier. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, makes sense. Like, so you match people with apps so well that you don't really need to provide quality anymore. Yeah, so that makes sense. I think the answer to your question is, it's not something we can again document with our data, because we don't have kind of this before and after personalization period where we see Wayfair changing prices. Wayfair does set its own prices, so they might have thought about kind of adjusting it once things are personalized. But basically what, if we could look at it, what I would expect is exactly what you described. Now they're much better at matching people with items. So now when I'm setting a price for each item, I know that the only group of people that buys that weird looking bed is a group of consumers with niche preferences who value those kind of attributes that I'm offering a lot. I can charge more and the demand is less elastic. So probably the equilibrium prices should go up.
I think actually it's a little delicate, because the personalization algorithm might now give me 4 beds with those attributes, and so before, when I was the only bed in that with that attribute in the consideration set, I might have had more market power. So it's a little more subtle, and it's really about how well the algorithm is working. It's not obvious that you're going to have a monotonic effect in the quality of the algorithm. That would be another way to say it.
Yeah, and then once you start thinking about long-term effects, you might be looking at more competition in the market in the long term, because now there are lower entry barriers. And
the entry problem as well.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting problem to tackle. We cannot tackle it, unfortunately, with this data, but someone should write a paper about that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thanks. Any other questions? Anything at all about the data, the model?
A follow-up on the algorithm conversation we had all the way at the beginning, which is there any evidence, or with this algorithm, do they ever direct you towards lower cost items, right? I think I'm trying to remember if this was answered, meaning like, think of it as these very out there type of beds may actually be with cheaper material, rather than the classic kind of core stuff is hardwood, metal, these types of things. Are they, in some sense, are we missing something where they're really just directing towards higher markup items that just don't have higher prices? Right. I don't know if that makes sense, but like
that makes a lot of sense. That was kind of part of that was exactly the study we had in mind, where we introduced kind of this imperfect correlation, because what the retailer thinks the preferences are and what the preferences really are, right? Because the incentives may not be aligned. You might be showing people, I don't know, metal beds because they are high markup, but what people really want is beds made of wood. And so then you will see that in the data, to some extent, how we talk about this in our identification strategy, you would see that the retailer is showing everyone metal beds at the top, but nobody is clicking on them, despite the fact that they're in the first positions. And what they're really clicking on is wooden beds. And so we can actually measure that correlation from the data. We do find some evidence that they are directing some people towards higher markup items as opposed to preferences. That's exactly why we see that the correlation between kind of these two sets of parameters is not 1, it's 0.50 something. So we do find some evidence, but that evidence is not very strong.
And so that may, like, going back to your revenue estimates or revenue on that table, the small gains in revenue might actually be hiding the fact that there could be larger gains somewhere else, right?
Right. We didn't have data on costs, so we would love to kind of look at markups and costs. That, of course, that would be fantastic. We could not access that data. So that might be one thing we're somewhat missing. Another thing is sponsored items. So I have not talked much about it, but Some manufacturers pay for being at the top of the results, at the top of the ranking. They get bumped kind of independently from the algorithm. They just get bumped to the top. That's a big part of the revenues. That's kind of the advertising model they have. And that's kind of accounting for that must be something, maybe something we'll think about in the future as well, but we don't account for that now. But the general point holds, which is, yes, we document 4.5% of revenues. It's huge for the size of the business. It's not overwhelming, but we might be missing some parts of the profit function.
Thank you. I am going to stop the recording here, but everyone can stay and continue to ask questions.